Tate Chronicles now transmitting.
Welcome to the Tate Chronicles on HealthcareNOW Radio. And now, here's your host, Jim Tate.
Good day, citizens of the free world, from border to border, coast to coast, and to all the ships at sea, I bring you a warm welcome. This is your correspondent, Jim Tate, and thank you for tuning in to the Tate Chronicles. Join me as we cut through the fog that exists at the leading edge of healthcare technology. Our mission is simple. We're searching for beneficial disruption in healthcare from emerging technologies. I'm really glad today our guest is Stanley Nachimson. Stanley was at CMS for over 20 years, served as the Senior Technical Advisor in the Office of e-Health Standards and Systems. He's been an active participant in the rise of health information technology and related standards. After he left CMS, Stanley founded Nachimson Advisors, which offers consulting to healthcare organizations and technology companies in the areas of such things as healthcare standards, compliance, privacy, and security. He's a nationally known author, presenter, and educator on these issues. I first met Stanley, 10 or 12 years ago, and always look forward to the opportunity to talk with him. So, Stanley, welcome to the Tate Chronicles, and thanks for sharing your time with us.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's great to be here, and always a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, one thing I've never had a chance to ask you about is how the heck did you get started in healthcare standards and technology when it didn't even exist, a few decades ago? What brought you into this world of standards?
Great question, and actually it's sort of a funny story. It tells you at least where my judgment was back a number of years ago. I was working for CMS, working on a big project collecting Medicaid data, and we were just ready to complete the project and launch the system when my boss pulls me in and says, I want you to start working on implementation of this new law. It's called HIPAA. It's all about electronic standards, and I want you to be our representative to the agency working group that's putting together the implementation process. And I looked at him and says, I don't want to do that. I don't know that much about it, and I'm just ready to complete this project, and we're going to get it rolling. And I thought I was going to get a lot of accolades from this other project. And he looked at me and he says, I don't particularly care what you think. This is what you're going to do. So I sort of, dropped my head, walked out of my office and said, okay, I guess I'm going to have to learn about this and participated. And that was sort of the beginning of the HIPAA implementation, the electronic standards that are now in widespread use throughout the industry. I did not realize at the time what a big impact it was going to have on health information technology and really making the industry a lot more efficient than it was at that time, moving more and more information into the electronic age. So although it was sort of a surprise to me and not necessarily my choice, I was very fortunate to have been put on that project, and I continue working on health information technology to this day.
Well, it's as they say, Stanley, sometimes some folks have greatness thrust upon them. And I think that sounds like it happened. You were at the right place at the right time. And one thing that's always kind of fascinated me about the whole HIPAA and privacy and security issue, it's under the Office of Civil Rights. So it is considered a human right to have privacy and security of their health records. So
yes, and I think it was a good move to give that responsibility really for enforcing that to the Office for Civil Rights, because they had the capability of recognizing when something was violated, a human right, a civil right, or something was violated, and knew how to go out and investigate potential violations and get the violators to stop doing what they were doing and improve things. So a perfect place for for that kind of work. I mean, what was interesting about putting all of the HIPAA requirements and the responsibility for implementing the electronic exchange of data in CMS was that CMS was used to really just working within the Medicare and the Medicaid programs. Didn't really have the expertise to deal with the whole rest of the industry, other health plans, vendors, and things like that. And what we had to do was really reach out to all of the players in the industry to help us in developing the right standards, the right way of selecting the standards and implementing the standards, answering the questions, helping people plan for this stuff. There was tremendous outreach done during those years, and I think you can see even today how the Office of the National Coordinator goes out there with requests for information in public-private partnerships, as well as ongoing committees to continue to work with the industry, because the government doesn't really have, all of the answers. It's critical to work with the industry partners to get this thing done correctly.
You have such a long career at CMS that, to me, that makes you pretty much an historian on the entire trajectory of health information technology. And so coming from really what we had as a paper-based system, and then moving forward, and I guess it was, I don't know if it was the first Bush or the second Bush that said, we want a national interoperable healthcare system in 10 years or whatever they said, all through those periods up to where we are now. And so could you maybe touch on a few of the trends you've seen over the last 20-plus years, and just where we are in the trajectory, and what areas still need a lot of attention?
Absolutely, Jim, and we've actually come a long way. The HIPAA regulations and standards focused more on administrative data, the work that was done between providers and health plans in filing claims, getting paid, or in inquiring as to health plan eligibility, things like that. It did not deal at first with the clinical information that's so prevalent. But as the President Bush said, we want to have, he sort of said everybody's going to have an electronic health record in 10 years. And I think things have changed. So we first began to standardize this administrative data and move it from paper to electronic, and there was a recognition that it is more effective and efficient, and you can begin to use the data in more ways than you could if you just had the information in paper files. So the recognition of that move really spurred the implementation of electronic health records, where the first move was to say, hey, providers, we want to get you at least onto an electronic health record. And the initial incentives were put in place so that providers would buy, primarily individual docs and hospitals, would buy an electronic health record and begin to implement it. That was step one, which was a good step because it got folks at least interested in electronic health records. Then the next standardization was, okay, what exactly should electronic health records do? What's the data that they should be collecting, and what are the functions that they should be providing? And the government placed requirements on the electronic health record vendors to say, these are the things that the industry in general agrees ought to be part of an electronic health record. So providers will be able to do step one, step two, step three, collect problem lists, have a formatted note, keep a certain set of information in your history, your clinical history, so that it begins to, every provider begins to have the same types of information. So we began to standardize those functions and the data. But the real step that was missing was the exchange of all of that information. It was great that it was sitting in electronic health records all across the country, and it could potentially be accessed by a provider, an individual provider, but how about taking that information and giving it to other providers so that they could put together information and look at an entire patient's clinical history? How about taking that information and making it available to patients so that they could build their own electronic health record, they could download the information on their phone and have that readily at their fingertips, or if they were switching providers, they could have the information and say, hey, here's all the information from my other provider. You uploaded it into your system. So where we are today is this interoperability complex where we're trying to figure out the best way for this electronic health record information to move from one provider to another provider, from a provider to his patients, from a provider to health plans, again, so that the health plan perhaps can put together a record for an individual and help that individual manage its health and get that information from a variety of providers. So it's kind of exciting that we're going to see, I believe, an explosion of electronic information being shared among all of the players in the healthcare system. And, when you get better information, I think you can make better decisions, and that's really what it comes down to. It's not just sharing information for the sake of sharing information. It's getting that information in the right hands and analyzing it to assist everyone in providing better care for patients.
The first part of what you were talking about there, Stanley, was the federal government's commitment to get providers and hospitals to adopt electronic health record systems, and this was done through the meaningful use EHR incentive programs, both through Medicare and Medicaid. From my memory, it seems like EHR adoption was maybe stalled at between 20 and 30%. And after 5 or 6 years of the federal level stimulation, we're probably between 80 and 90%, maybe greater, I don't know. So that has been very successful. So that challenge has been addressed. The challenge, as you mentioned, of interoperability has ended up being much more complex than certainly I thought. I don't know if you thought it would be this complex, but it's a hydra with many heads, it seems like. And, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say that I think what happened in terms of interoperability is there was a lack of agreement among vendors and providers and patients about, first of all, what information should really be part of an electronic health record, and that differed from provider to provider. Remember, you've got cardiologists and orthopedists and general practitioners and specialty hospitals and general hospitals and tertiary hospitals. So you have a wide variety of providers, each with their own specific need to gather information and process that information. So I think that was one of the problems. As opposed to claims, things like that, the administrative functions were fairly well understood. Everybody submitted a claim. Everybody submitted sort of the same paper claim. But you've got doctors that have different ways of collecting clinical information, different lab tests, different ways of putting together histories. So that, I think, the content of that data was really the key issue. And that's what has, I think, kept things from progressing even faster. There's still a lot of disagreement as to what really needs to be part of a patient's history, for example, and how best to put that together. So we're working slowly but surely towards some agreement, but we've got a lot of work to do.
On the technical side, the standards and data elements and data tables have been agreed upon, but to me it seems like there's some big cultural issues that still exist. An example I give is over the last 10 years, patient involvement or knowledge of their own health records whatsoever has gone to from nothing. Our parents' generation, they never had access to the records. They didn't want access to the records. And that kind of carries forward. There's certainly every legitimate electronic health record system has a patient portal. But as they say, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So the technology's there, but will people, the average consumer or patient, step up? Go ahead. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
That's a great question, and I've thought a lot about that. I think we pay more attention to our car maintenance than we do to our individual maintenance. I mean, folks keep track of their gas mileage when they need their next break. job, or we've got technology available for that. I mean, the cars today will even tell you that they're low on this, or it's time for an oil change, time for scheduled maintenance. We don't necessarily have that internally, or even with any of our providers. It's sort of all floating out there. I think it would be ideal if there was an app on your phone where you kind of checked in every morning and said, okay, I'm here. What's up today? And the app on the phone would come back and say, well, morning, Stanley. We've checked your weight, and looks like you've been eating a couple of too many donuts here, so knock that off. Make sure you have a light lunch and a sensible dinner because you need to get your weight down. Your blood pressure is staying relatively steady. It's a little bit high. Let's see what we can do to reduce that. It's time for your quarterly test of your cholesterol, and we continue to track that. Those kinds of things is what would be ideal for individuals, but it has to be done in a way that's simple for the individual, accurate, and can gather the necessary data. So I'm looking for something like that eventually to happen if we can get the industry to agree on sharing the necessary data, and we get developers in place to create those necessary applications. And with the progress that we've been making in the standardization of clinical information and the technologies, we're getting closer to that. You're right, Jim. There's a cultural issue here, and everyone talks about what comes first. Do we really need the apps first, and then we'll build the right data, or do we need to make the data available first, and then the apps will follow? I think that's a good question, and maybe in your experience, you can think about which came first, the application or the data.
Yeah, that's true. Personally, I'm in a healthcare system where my internal medicine provider is part of a hospital system, and so there's a unified health record and a unified portal. And the main thing I use it for is fantastic for medication refills, or if I have a question for my provider, I can just don't have to pick up a phone and have anybody answer it and scribble anything down. It goes to the provider, and it's like email. They just answer it at their convenience, or a nurse refills a prescription. I find it a great communication tool, but I don't have any complex chronic health challenges. Those folks, I think, would benefit from really being able to have an accurate health record that they could, exchange when they get referred to other providers or things like that. The more complex it is, the more important it is for a provider to have access to your total health history, it seems like. Yes,
I agree 100% that you can, again, you have access to that to make better decisions, to help coordinate care, to help manage costs, to prevent duplicate testing. I think there are a good number of reasons to provide sharing of data. Now you're within one health system. If you were to go to another health system, is there an easy way for you to get the data out and give it to the next health system?
Well, I just download some of those CCDA files and or forward them from my portal to another portal. Okay, well, so, then the technology exists. Although we seem to be advancing, the groups are now moving forward from CCDA documents to something else. There's a new and improved core data set. It used to be the Common Core data set. Now it's the United States Core data set for interoperability. So they're adding more data elements. But importantly, what they're doing is reaching out to the public, getting suggestions to the public, and putting together a process to update the standards more quickly. If you look at the update process for the HIPAA standards, I mean, we've managed to have basically one update in about 15 years, and they're working on the second update that may be
in place by the time we reach the 30-year HIPAA mark. That's way too slow in terms of changes in technology, changes in healthcare, those kinds of things. So the government is actually looking at the regulations and putting together ways to allow the industry to decide among themselves when would be the best time to upgrade the standards instead of waiting for the 8 or 10 year process for the federal government to go through regulations. I think that's a big part of it in enabling advances in technology, so you're not using technology and standards that are 10 or 15 years old.
Well, that kind of, to me, brings up the issue of government legislation. And it seems like every maybe 5 to 7 years there'll be something big come through. We had the meaningful use legislation, and then we had the macro MIPS legislation. Maybe a year and a half ago, we had the 21st Century Cure Act come through. And so part of that brings additional focus on interoperability. What are your thoughts on maybe some of the major themes in that legislation?
Again, I think it's the focus on quality. There were ways to try and get medications to the market faster, opening up a number of the federal processes to make things happen more quickly and getting the federal government out of the way. And the focus, I think, that continues today in some of the work that this administration is doing in getting more information out to the public. There was a regulation that was published to require drug companies to make the cost of their drugs a part of the commercials that we see every day.
Oh,
Unfortunately, yesterday a judge put a halt to that, saying the administration had overstepped their bounds. But there is a clear direction in this administration to really make information available to individuals on cost, on quality, on all of their medical information. It's, again, trying to move towards perhaps a more patient-centered and consumer-friendly healthcare system.
Well, let me switch focus here for just a minute. We only have about 5 more minutes, and there's a couple more things I want to get your opinion on. You were certainly there when HIPAA blossomed, and so privacy and security have been a giant issue for years, but it was one thing when all the data was in silos. Now with all these portals and smartphone apps and patient interaction with that data, just what are your thoughts or concerns about how that data can be protected? Because I guess some way it falls on the the consumer, the patient, who now is handling their data.
Yes, and part of there are, I think, 2 ways that we need to look at it. Part of it is awareness. The fact that when you download the data on your phone, it becomes available, and you have to be very careful with it. There are a lot of people in the, I'll call it the younger generations, of people that are even putting information on Facebook and other sites that don't realize how easily accessible that information is and how it can fall into the wrong hands. I mean, we've heard of people that didn't get a job because they went to the interview and the interviewer pops up their Facebook page and there's some bizarre stuff going on there. People get fired from their jobs because things pop up. So the first step is the awareness that any information that you get may very well be subject to access by people that perhaps you don't want to have it. That's step one. Secondly, I think we need some stronger protections in the apps and maybe even some ways for either the government or a private enterprise to measure the privacy and security capabilities of any app and say this one's good, this one's not so good. Much as we have certified electronic health records, we might need to look for ways to certify some of these apps, especially for privacy and security. It's a legitimate concern that as the more data that is out there being exchanged means it's more liable to be intercepted somehow. We have to be very careful about that. Seems like every solution brings its own problems. So, yes, it's great to have more and more data out there available for exchange, but that means that there's more and more reasons that it might be intercepted and fall into the wrong hands.
Absolutely. Well, just from our discussion here today, Stanley, interoperability, it's part technology, it's part policy, part culture, part workflow. And so it's complex, but the whole trajectory is bending towards resolution of these issues. But before we totally run out of time, how can someone get in contact with you, Stanley?
Best way would be through my email address. I would say the company email address is Nachimson, Nachimson _advisors, ADVISORS, at Verizon.net. And I'd be delighted to answer questions or help people understand what's coming up and what regulations are coming up and what they need to do to adapt.
Well, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today on this episode of the Tate Chronicles. I offer a special salute to my guest, Stanley Nachimson. Stanley, thanks for coming aboard today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Jim. It's been a great journey with you.
Yeah, you can find more information on this show's program page at HealthcareNOWradio.com. Until we meet again, here's wishing you smooth sailing and safe harbors.
Tate Chronicles transmission ending now.